All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to tackle a really big and honestly a super misunderstood idea, classical utilitarianism.
And this is it, right? This is the classic dilemma, the first thing that pops into your head when you hear utilitarianism. This idea of some cold, hard calculation where maybe, just maybe, you've got to do something pretty terrible for the so-called greater good.
But it turns out that this image, this picture of a moral calculator, weighing every single tiny choice, it's mostly a caricature. It kind of misses the real story, which, honestly, is way more surprising and interesting. Okay, so let's start right there. Let's break down this common misunderstanding and really get to the heart of what these thinkers were actually trying to accomplish.
See, the caricature is all about these extreme one-off choices, like that classic ticking time bomb scenario. But the reality, the original utilitarians weren't really thinking about that stuff. They were looking at the big picture. They weren't focused on your single decision, but on the whole system we live in.
And that's because the pioneers of this idea, guys like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, they really thought of themselves as social critics and political reformers. They weren't trying to be your personal life coach telling you what to do every second. No, they were trying to reform society itself.
So instead of this personal rulebook, they saw their philosophy as this powerful tool for social reform, a way to improve society.
This is a really key idea called indirect utilitarianism. What does that mean? Well, it means the main principle, the greatest good for the greatest number, isn't something you're supposed to apply to every single thing you do. Instead, it's a tool for thinking at a higher level about the rules and systems that guide all of our lives.
Okay, so how does that actually work? It's kind of like a three-step process. Step 1, you pick something. A law, an institution, even just a social norm. Step 2, you look at its overall consequences. Is this thing, on balance, creating more happiness and well-being, or is it causing a bunch of suffering? And then step 3, based on that assessment, you either argue to reform it, or, hey, maybe even reinforce it if it's working well.
You see how this just completely changes the game, right? The goal is to figure out if our social structures are actually doing what they're supposed to do, reducing suffering and promoting happiness, or if they're just causing a lot of unnecessary pain. It turns the whole philosophy from this heavy personal burden into a practical framework for making things better.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting. We can take this same logic and apply it to something super personal, our own moral feelings.
Think about guilt and shame. Are they useful? Well, from a utilitarian perspective, they're painful feelings, so by default, they're bad. They're only justified if, and this is a big if, they prevent even greater suffering down the line. So, for example, feeling guilt about racism? Yeah, that probably has utility, because it can help stop the immense pain of discrimination. But what about feeling shame over some private, harmless part of your life? That likely has no utility at all. It's just causing pain for no good reason. And you can apply the exact same logic to something like criminal law. Punishment, by its very nature, causes suffering, so it's only justified if it deters even more harm than it creates. This is why a lot of utilitarians are really critical of punishing so-called victimless crimes, because if there's no victim, where's the harm you're preventing?
All right, let's move on to what might be the most radical part of utilitarianism. And that's how it expands our whole idea of the moral circle.
I mean, for a lot of history, the common good was a pretty local concept. If you were in ancient Greek, it pretty much just meant the good of the citizens in your own little city-state, a very small circle.
But the utilitarians, they just blew that boundary wide open. For them, the common good had to be universal. It had to be impartial. It has to take into account the interests of all affected parties, everyone. And Jeremy Bentham, one of the founders, really drove this point home with an absolutely brilliant question that just changes everything.
So the point isn't about being smart or being able to speak. The only thing that matters, morally, is the capacity to suffer, to be a sentient being. And just like that, the circle of moral concern radically expands to include non-human animals.
Okay, this brings us to one last, really important question. What exactly is this happiness we're trying to maximize? What did they really mean by it?
So the ancient Greeks had this idea of eudaimonia, which is kind of like fulfillment or flourishing. It was about achieving all these different things: knowledge, honor, talent. It wasn't just about feeling good. The utilitarians, though, were hedonists. For them, it all boiled down to one thing: the quality of our experience, how we feel.
For a classical utilitarian, there's really only one thing that's good in and of itself, and that's increasing the amount of desirable consciousness in the world. Pleasure, well-being, whatever you want to call it. Things like knowledge or art are great, for sure, but they're valuable because they lead to that desirable state of consciousness. They're a means to an end.
So let's wrap this all up. What we've seen is that utilitarianism isn't really about being a moral calculator for every little decision you make. It's much more like a compass for social progress. It's a way of looking at our world, our laws, our institutions, and asking a simple question. How can we make this better? How can we create less pain and more well-being for everyone?
And that really leaves us with a pretty big question to chew on, doesn't it? If we actually use this tool today, which of our society's rules and norms would pass the test? And more importantly, which ones wouldn't?